You've probably heard, to save for your child's college expenses, that's a 529 plan. But is a 529 plan the best option for you? Maybe, and maybe not. Today, I'm talking about 529 plans, what I'm calling the good, the bad, and the sometimes downright ugly. Stay tuned. What to know about 529s coming up. Hey everyone, it's Jeff Drayton, Certified Financial Planner Professional and founder of Jeffrey A. Drayton Financial Planning and Wealth Management, LLC. In these videos, I share my thoughts on financial planning topics for individuals and households. If you're watching this video on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe. And as always, if you are viewing this from my website, fill out that sign-up form at the top of the blog page so that we can contact you when new content becomes available. Today, I'm talking about 529 college savings plans, specifically what I'm calling the good, the bad, and the sometimes ugly, which is to say 529 plans have a little of each. First up, let me just explain what a 529 plan is. 529s are state-sponsored tax advantage savings plans that can be used for education expenses. Technically, they come in two types: 529 college savings plans and 529 prepaid tuition plans. The latter, however, prepaid tuition plans, have fallen enough out of favor that I'm not going to discuss them here. If you think you might be interested in a 529 prepaid tuition plan, I suggest that you speak directly with your personal certified financial planner practitioner. So that leaves us with the college savings plan. With a 529 college savings plan, you make contributions with after-tax dollars, meaning there is no current tax benefit for contributing to the plan, at least not at the federal level. However, when you go to withdraw these funds, presumably when your child is attending college, you will owe no taxes on the gains that your savings have produced, provided that those funds are used to pay for qualified education expenses. That's a good deal. Furthermore, as of 2018, these funds are no longer restricted to exclusively higher education expenses, such as colleges, universities, or technical schools. Going forward, 529 assets can also be used for private education at the primary or secondary level. So, what are the positives of 529 plans? What I would call the good. Well, there are several. First is the obvious tax advantage of not having to pay taxes on the gains in your 529 plan, provided that you use your plan savings for qualified education expenses. This is especially valuable to higher wage earning households in that, unlike many other tax advantage savings options, 529 plans do not have an income limit. Anyone 18 or older can have a 529 plan. Furthermore, the contribution limits in 529 plans are generally quite high. Given that these are state-sponsored plans, the limits vary. However, unlike some other college savings plan types, 529 plan contribution limits are rarely an obstacle in getting enough money into the plan to fully fund your student's anticipated education expense. For these reasons, a 529 plan for high wage earners is generally a sound recommendation. Another positive with a 529 plan, the possibility of receiving a tax benefit for your contribution at the state level. Remember, there is no tax benefit for contributions at the federal level. These are made with after-tax dollars. However, some states do offer a state-level benefit. Here, you will want to check the rules in your state to see if a benefit does exist and, if yes, what the qualification rules are. So, what are some of the not so good aspects of a 529 plan? What I will call the bad. Unfortunately, 529 plans have a few of these also. The first I would mention is expenses. And here, I'm not talking about simply the expenses attributable to the investment options in the plan, say the internal expenses of the mutual funds in which your contributions will likely be invested, but instead the expense of the plan itself. There likely will be some. Some states' 529 plans have expenses that are quite reasonable. However, others, not so much. And realize this is an expense that you are bearing simply for the privilege of participating in that 529 plan. Which brings up a second difficulty of investing in 529 plans: complexity. Because 529 plans are state-sponsored, there are a lot of them. Figuring out which is the best state-sponsored 529 plan for you might not be an easy task. One might think, don't I simply choose the plan in my state? However, no, that's not necessarily the case. Often, there is no negative consequence for choosing a 529 plan in a state other than your own. Therefore, you are going to want to do the research necessary to choose the best plan for you. Things you will want to consider are, does your state offer a state tax benefit for participating in a 529 plan? And if yes, what are the requirements to receive that benefit? Possibly, that could affect your choice of plans. Also, what are the investment options in the 529 plan? And just as importantly, what are the investment expenses associated with those options? And as I said before, what are the expenses associated simply with the plan itself? These and others are considerations you should be aware of when choosing the 529 plan that is right for you. Lastly, there are some genuine pitfalls to be aware of when considering your 529 plan participation, what I would call the ugly. And here, let me mention a few. The first is the consequences that 529 plan savings might potentially have on your student's eligibility for future financial aid. This is one that moderate to less than moderate wage earners should especially be aware of. 529 plan assets are dedicated education savings, and therefore, when your student goes to fill out his or her FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, those 529 plan assets are fully reportable. They will likely have the effect of raising your EFC, or expected family contribution. Don't get me wrong, I certainly would not suggest that you should therefore not be saving for your child's future education. Saving is always a good thing. However, if you are not a high wage earner, you might want to consider a saving strategy that will not diminish your opportunity for future financial aid. One possibility might be a Roth IRA. A Roth IRA, or Roth Individual Retirement Account, is not dedicated savings for higher education and therefore is also not reportable on the FAFSA. However, if needed, you would very likely have the ability to access those assets, or at least some portion of them, tax-free should you need to pay for some part of your child's education expenses. Here, you will want to consult with your financial planner. Accessing retirement savings while your child is attending school can be as detrimental to your financial aid eligibility, if not more so, than 529 savings. However, there are strategies that can be employed to mitigate this. Another potential ugly consequence of a 529, putting too much money into your 529 plan. Imagine the scenario in which your last child graduates from college, leaving you with no more qualified education expenses in front of you, and yet you still have assets in your 529. What then? Well, you have a few options. However, if you would like to simply withdraw those funds and use them for a non-qualified education expense purpose, you will face the following consequences. First, any gains in your distribution will be taxed to you as ordinary income in the year of that distribution. Additionally, those gains will also be subject to a 10% penalty. And lastly, if you received any state tax benefits on your contributions, those benefits will likely have to be paid back. You know, I once saw a video in which the person suggested, if you put too much money in a 529, don't worry, that's just money you wouldn't have had anyway. Well, certainly, that is not the advice of a financial planner. One could easily imagine that a person whose last child has just graduated from college is likely in the later part of their own career, possibly making as much money as they ever will. Taking a non-qualified distribution from a 529 at that point means that the gains on their distribution will be added to their income for the year, getting taxed at their highest or marginal tax rate. At the federal level, this could easily be 32% or more. Furthermore, if they live in a state like mine that also charges a state income tax, they will need to pay that also. In my state, that might be close to 10%. And on top of all that, they will also owe a 10% non-qualified distribution penalty. In other words, potentially half of their gains or more might be lost in taxes and penalties. Had this money simply been in a non-qualified account, say a brokerage account, making gains via the appreciation of stock and/or receiving qualified dividend or interest payments, quite possibly here the tax would simply be at a capital gains rate of 15%. In other words, overfunding your 529 plan could be a consequentially costly mistake. One that might easily make it worth your time to try and get an accurate estimate of what your future higher education expenses will be. I recommend by speaking to your, hopefully, certified financial planner professional. I'm Jeff Drayton. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, as always, nothing in this video is meant to be specific advice for you. Advice like that can only be had by working with a financial planner, someone who knows you and your situation. I would encourage you to seek out someone who is a certified financial planner. This is signified by the letters CFP with the registered trademark sign following his or her name. I would also encourage you to work with a fee-only financial planner. Now that's two words, fee-only, not fee-based, not fee plus commission. Both of those terms mean that the planner or advisor can receive commissions and is therefore not free of the conflict of interest inherent to commission sales. Again, I'm Jeff Drayton. Thanks for watching.